Chapter 1. The Royal Barber's Appointment. In the heart of a majestic kingdom, nestled between towering mountains and endless seas, lived a beautiful and talented woman named Seraphina. Her skills as a barber were unparalleled, a gift she had honed since childhood. Raised in a small village, Seraphina had always been drawn to the art of grooming, captivated by the way a simple cut or style could transform a person. Her hands, delicate yet strong, worked with precision and care, leaving every client feeling renewed and regal. But little did she know that her life would take a turn she never expected. One fateful day, the royal palace sent word that they were in search of a new personal barber for the king, a position that was reserved for only the finest in the land. It was an honor and a challenge, one that few had the skill or courage to undertake. Seraphina, eager to prove herself, packed her belongings and made her way to the palace. As she walked through the grand gates, she marveled at the towering spires and intricate carvings that adorned every wall. The palace was a place of beauty and power, a realm where royalty lived, surrounded by the finest luxuries. Upon entering the royal chambers, Seraphina found herself face to face with the king, a tall and commanding figure whose eyes held the weight of the kingdom. King Alastair was known for his wisdom and strength, ruling with a firm but just hand. He was a man whose presence could silence a room, yet when he spoke, his words were always thoughtful and measured. "Welcome, Seraphina," King Alastair said, his voice deep and authoritative. "We have heard much about your talents. Today we shall see if you are worthy of the royal position." Seraphina bowed respectfully, her heart racing with both excitement and nervousness. "Your Majesty, I am honored by the opportunity. I will do my utmost to serve you with the best of my abilities." The king gestured to the grand throne, where he sat with a regal air, awaiting her approach. With steady hands, Seraphina prepared her tools, a pair of finely crafted scissors, a comb, and her prized hair-dryer, which she held with a sense of pride. The royal barber's craft was more than a job to her. It was a sacred art, one that she practiced with passion and dedication. As she carefully worked on the king's hair, Seraphina noticed how different he was from the rumors she had heard. His strength was undeniable, but beneath his commanding exterior there was a kindness and gentleness that only those closest to him would know. She realized that his regal presence was not just the result of his title, but of the way he carried himself, always poised, always in control. The minutes passed, and Seraphina worked with the utmost concentration. She was aware that her every movement was being watched, but her confidence grew with each stroke. The king remained silent, his eyes closed in quiet contemplation as she worked her magic. Finally, after what felt like hours, Seraphina took a step back and surveyed her work. The king's hair had been transformed into a masterpiece, neat, polished, and perfectly suited to his powerful image. She dared not speak, unsure if her work had met his high expectations. King Alastair opened his eyes and stood, inspecting himself in the mirror. A smile crept onto his lips, the first genuine expression of approval he had shown. "You have done well, Seraphina. In fact, you have done better than well. You have earned your place here." Seraphina's heart soared with pride, but she knew this was only the beginning. The position she had been granted came with great responsibility, and she was determined to prove that she could be more than just a barber to the king. She would become an integral part of his world, a trusted confidant, and a symbol of grace and beauty in his court. But as she left the royal chambers that day, her thoughts were not just on her success. A quiet whisper had begun to stir within her, an awareness of the king's gaze upon her. His appreciation for her skill had been clear, but there was something more in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. It was as if her beauty, her talent, had ignited something deeper within him. Seraphina couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold. Would she remain just the royal barber, or was there a deeper connection waiting to be discovered? And so, the first chapter of her new life had begun, one filled with promise and uncertainty, beauty and power, and a destiny that was yet to unfold. Chapter 2. The Bond Unveils. The days following Seraphina's appointment as the royal barber were filled with the hum of palace life. The grand halls echoed with the laughter of courtiers, the soft rustle of silk gowns, and the solemn murmur of officials discussing matters of the kingdom. Yet, amidst the bustle, Seraphina's work was always her focus. She had found a rhythm in her craft, and each day, as she styled the king's hair with meticulous care, she noticed something new. King Alistair had become a regular fixture in her life. Every morning he would enter her chamber with a calm yet commanding presence. His demeanor remained as regal as ever, but now there was a gentleness that crept into his voice when he spoke to her. The once impersonal, business-like tone had been replaced by a familiarity that slowly bridged the gap between them. Seraphina had always admired his wisdom, but now she saw more. A man who carried the weight of a kingdom with grace, who was not just a ruler, but a protector. There were moments when their eyes would meet in the mirror as she worked, and for a brief second she could see a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken. On one particularly quiet morning, as Seraphina ran her comb through the king's silver locks, he spoke softly. "Seraphina, you have proven your worth to the kingdom, but I must ask, why did you come here? What drives you to give your art so freely?" Seraphina paused, her hand steadying for a moment as she considered his question. It was the first time he had asked about her life outside the palace. Most of the time, they exchanged pleasantries or discussed royal matters, but this was different. "I come from humble beginnings, Your Majesty," she said softly. "My family was never wealthy, but we had something more precious: love, guidance, and the belief that any work done with passion could change lives. I learned my craft from my mother, who believed that beauty was more than just appearance. It was an expression of the soul." The king was silent for a moment, his gaze focused on the mirror as he seemed to contemplate her words. The air between them felt charged, as if they were sharing a moment of connection that went beyond their roles, her as a servant and him as a king. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," King Alistair finally said, his voice quiet. "It seems that wisdom runs in your family." Seraphina smiled, but there was a softness in her eyes that she hadn't realized was there. "I try my best to live by it, Your Majesty, to help people see themselves as they truly are." As the days passed, their conversations became more personal. Seraphina shared stories of her childhood, her dreams, and the lessons she had learned from her mother. In return, King Alistair spoke of his past, of the sacrifices he had made to protect his kingdom, and the loneliness that often accompanied his position. He confessed that Ruling was a burden, one that he bore not for glory, but for the love he held for his people. Despite his royal status, Seraphina saw a vulnerability in him that few outside the palace would ever notice. There were nights when he would remain in her chamber longer than necessary, not because he required any more work, but because he seemed to find solace in her presence. One evening, as Seraphina worked on his hair, she noticed the familiar weight of the silence between them. The warmth of the fire crackled softly in the background, casting a golden glow over their faces. She felt something stir in her chest, a sense of closeness, of understanding. "Your Majesty," she began hesitantly, "if you ever need someone to talk to, you know you can confide in me. I may be just your barber, but I value our conversations, and I would be honored to be someone you trust." Alistair turned to face her, his gaze intense, yet softened by a quiet gratitude. "And I value yours, Seraphina. You have no idea how much your words mean to me." In that moment, there was a shift in their dynamic, a bond that went beyond the roles they played. Seraphina realized that what had begun as a professional relationship had evolved into something far deeper. She was no longer just a woman tending to the king's appearance. She was someone who had earned his trust, someone who understood the weight he carried, and someone he had come to rely on. As the evening wore on and Seraphina finished her work, she stepped back, admiring the king's appearance in the mirror. His face looked calm, his hair styled to perfection, but there was something else that had changed, a sense of peace, as if her presence had allowed him to breathe a little easier. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I hope you are satisfied." King Alistair smiled, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth she hadn't seen before. "I am more than satisfied, Seraphina. You have given me more than just a haircut. You have given me a rare gift, peace." The king left her chambers that evening with a renewed sense of gratitude. And as Seraphina watched him depart, she couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Was this the beginning of a deeper connection? Or would their relationship remain bound by duty and formality? Only time would tell. But for now, she was content knowing that she had done more than just serve the king. She had touched his heart in a way that would leave a lasting impact. Chapter 3. The Unspoken Truth. As the days continued to pass in the royal palace, the bond between Seraphina and King Alistair grew stronger, though neither fully understood the depth of it. Their interactions had always been professional, with moments of warmth and mutual respect, but the lines between servant and ruler were beginning to blur. They found comfort in each other's presence, sharing stories, wisdom, and laughter that echoed through the stone walls of the grand palace. However, with every passing day, Seraphina couldn't help but notice a shift in her own heart. What had begun as a simple admiration for the king's wisdom and strength had turned into something more complicated, something she had not anticipated. She found herself thinking of him not as a king, but as a man, one who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, but also had moments of vulnerability that she had come to cherish. King Alistair, too, felt the change. The moments they spent together had become the highlights of his day. He had always been surrounded by the cold formality of court life, but with Seraphina he felt something real, something genuine. There was a warmth in her presence that he could not find anywhere else. She listened to him, with a kind heart, offered him advice without judgment, and above all, treated him as a person, not just as a monarch. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting day of royal duties, the king entered Seraphina's chambers, as he often did. His face was drawn, the weight of his responsibilities clearly etched on his features. Yet, when he saw her, something in his demeanor softened. Her smile, her graceful movements, and the quiet comfort of her presence seemed to lift the burden, if only for a brief moment. Seraphina looked up from her work, sensing the weariness in the air. "Your Majesty, you look exhausted," she said, her voice gentle but full of concern. "Would you like me to prepare something to ease your mind?" Alistair shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "No, Seraphina. What I need most tonight is your company, your calming presence. This kingdom may be mine to rule, but it is people like you who make it worth ruling." Seraphina blushed slightly at his words, but her heart swelled with a quiet happiness. "I am honored, Your Majesty. I will always be here for you." He moved closer, sitting down in the chair where she had worked so many times before. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for the first time, the space between them felt charged with something unspoken, something that neither of them had dared to address. The connection they shared was undeniable, yet both were hesitant to give it a name, unsure of the consequences it might bring. As Seraphina finished her work, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. She had always respected him, but now there was something more. She cared for him deeply, in a way that went beyond duty or admiration. The thought of him as a man, a vulnerable, complex man, was something that stirred emotions she had never allowed herself to feel. "Your Majesty," Seraphina said, her voice trembling slightly as she finished styling his hair. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to not carry the weight of the kingdom on your shoulders? To live a life where you can simply be yourself without the burden of ruling?" King Alistair turned his gaze toward her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Every day," he admitted softly, "I often wonder what life could have been like if I had not been born a king. But then I look at the people who depend on me, and I remember why I must carry this burden." Seraphina nodded, understanding the weight of his words. But she couldn't help but wish, deep down, that he could experience a life outside of his crown. He deserved peace, happiness, freedom. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But, Your Majesty, you are not just a king, you are a man who deserves happiness too." For a moment, the room was silent. Neither of them spoke, both lost in their thoughts. Then, to Seraphina's surprise, Alistair stood and moved closer to her. His hand reached out, gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing against her skin in a tender, almost hesitant gesture. "Seraphina," he said softly, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I never expected to feel this way about anyone. You've become more than just my barber, more than just a servant. You've become my confidant, my friend, and now, perhaps something more." Seraphina's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. The king, her king, was speaking words she had longed to hear, but had never dared to hope for. She felt her own emotions rise, the connection between them undeniable. "I never expected this either," she whispered, her voice trembling as she took a step closer to him. "But I have come to care for you more than I ever thought possible." With those words, the unspoken truth between them was laid bare. There was no turning back now. The bond they shared had deepened into something neither of them could ignore, something neither of them could deny. King Alistair gazed into her eyes, his hand still resting gently on her face. "Seraphina, I do not know what the future holds, but I do know this. I want to face it with you by my side." And in that moment, Seraphina knew that whatever challenges they might face in the future, they would face them together as equals, as partners. The kingdom might still be his to rule, but she had become his greatest ally, his heart's companion. And so their journey together began, not just as a king and his barber, but as two souls bound by trust, love, and the promise of a shared future.